We've made it to our fifth Candid Policy Conversation episode. Welcome back, y'all. Continuing to have these talks that bring policy to the people. If you don't know by now, I'm Eric Felix, your host for these conversations and an assistant professor at San Diego State University. Our theme for today is the unmaking of higher education rules and regulations. Today's guest is Rebecca Natow, assistant professor at Hofstra University. She is a lawyer, higher education scholar, and literally wrote the book on the federal rulemaking process. Now let's learn more about Rebecca, her work, and a few related stories in the news. In my research for this conversation, I learned that you had a whole different career before becoming the amazing higher ed scholar you are. So can you tell me more about your journey to where you are today?
Yeah. So it's true. Right after I graduated from college, I went to law school at Georgetown University. And so I always thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And so there I was pursuing that dream, graduated from law school and got a job practicing law. And I realized pretty quickly that that wasn't going to be what I did with the rest of my career. I just knew there was something else out there that I had to do. And I thought back to when I was in law school, and what I enjoyed about it most was sort of the academic component of it. Meanwhile, I had some friends who had practiced law and they were a couple of years ahead of me, and they had decided to pursue different careers, and both of them went into higher education. One had gone into a master's program for higher ed, became working as a registrar. Another one just went straight into working at a law school as an advisor, an academic advisor. So I started looking into it and saw that was something I could do. So long story short, I decided to go to Teachers College, Columbia University, for the master's program in higher education, higher and post-secondary education. And when I was there, what I realized is that I really had an interest in policy research. And I decided to pursue the doctorate because, again, the academic aspects of the law were what I really enjoyed about it, basically since law school, and then again in graduate school for education. So that's how I wound up getting my doctorate.
As a faculty member, what drives your work?
That's an interesting question, and I've given a lot of thought to it. And I think that what drives my work is that because I went to law school, I just take for granted sometimes that I know a lot about how the federal government is structured and the Constitution and how federal courts are going to interpret the Constitution. And I think that knowledge has been really important in sort of understanding how policies get made, and when they get challenged in court, why courts rule the way they do, why decisions come down the way they do. And so I think that what's really driving my work is to provide that information for people who are studying education policy, because I believe that you can't really understand how policies get made and how an advocacy group or even an individual can have a voice in that process without understanding that entire context, how the process works, the Constitution, the government, and how it's structured. So that's why my studies look at those policymaking processes and those structures and those contexts and how they influence what policies get made. So a lot of education policy research, for example, look at a program or an educational intervention and determine, is this working? Is it being implemented the way it was intended? My research sort of takes a broader look at how did this policy come to be? What was involved? Why do we have this policy? If it wasn't implemented the way it was intended, why is that? So it's really taking a look at the structure and the process in the hope of, with the goal of informing people more about why we get the policies that we do.
What do you think your work is trying to advocate for, or even trying to dismantle?
Is understanding how little democracy we actually have. I think a lot of people realize that for the presidency, for example, that the person who gets the most votes doesn't necessarily become the president, right? So we've seen that happen in the 2016 election and the 2000 election. But then we have in the Senate a system where every state, no matter how many or how few people live in the state, they get the same number of senators. So that really skews the representation in the Senate to the more sparsely populated rural conservative states, getting the same number of senators as more densely populated states. And then a lot of people don't realize that the House of Representatives which has its own issues in terms of Democratic representation. But the House of Representatives doesn't have a say in, for example, confirming cabinet appointees or federal judges. So we're seeing a situation right now, as this is being recorded, where we're going to, in all likelihood, have a new Supreme Court justice just a few weeks before national elections. And the Senate is controlled by Republicans, the White House is controlled by Republicans. And so they're going to choose a judge that meets with their criteria, their satisfaction. The House of Representatives is controlled by Democrats, but the House has no say in that. So this is a long-winded way of saying that I don't think that my research alone is going to do it, but I do feel that if I can help, just a small number of people to understand that better, then I will have done my job.
Nice. Awesome. I'm interested in learning more about what's at stake for higher education based off how these elections go in November.
Oh, that's a great question, because there's so much at stake for higher education as there is for a lot of other areas. So in terms of the presidential election, President Trump has basically had 4 years to demonstrate how his administration is going to handle higher education policy issues. There was the rollback of some of the Obama-era regulations of the for-profit sector, and that happened in the Department of Education. Also, rollback of Title IX guidance and President Trump's views on higher education, which is that the for-profit sector shouldn't be regulated as much. And there were some due process issues with regard to Title IX that some advocates of sexual assault survivors have been saying would be dissuasive for survivors to come forward and report sexual assaults. In terms of the free college debate, so Joe Biden has put forth a plan for tuition-free community college, for tuition-free public college for students who have a family income of less than $125,000. Joe Biden has put forth a very detailed plan about funding for community colleges, not just the tuition-free community college, but also a variety of wraparound student services to help promote student success and retention. So you see right there very, very different policies with regard to higher education funding and access. So that's at the presidential level. We also have a congressional election that's going on, and the control of the Senate is really at stake in this election. I don't know which direction it's going to go. Currently, the Republicans have control of the Senate. There have been some polls recently that indicate that the Democrats have a chance at taking control of the Senate. And that can obviously be very consequential for what kind of policies get passed. If Joe Biden were to win the election and the Democrats were to maintain control of the House of Representatives and take control of the Senate, then there's a chance that some of these policies that Joe Biden's been talking about on the campaign can actually get enacted. If the Republicans retain control of the Senate, then it's unlikely that we'll see any of the policies that Joe Biden's been talking about on the campaign trail get enacted. And then, of course, even if the Democrats do get control of the Senate, they have to decide within their own caucus, are they going to change the rules so that there isn't going to be a filibuster for legislation like this? And then even then, there are a number of more moderate and conservative Democrats that are not willing so far, at least publicly, to sign on to Joe Biden's tuition-free college plan. So there's a lot at stake, and a lot of it still needs to be determined following the election. What if the Democrats are successful, back the White House and the Senate, what are they going to do within their own caucus to see that some of these policies get passed?
One of the things you allude to is that, the different parties have different power in the Senate and in the House and then in the White House as well. And so the Prosper Act was out there for a couple of years. College Affordability Act is currently there. What will it take for a reauthorization of HEA? How does our collective action in November help or hinder that reauthorization?
That's a really excellent question, because as you know, we haven't had an HEA reauthorization since 2008. It's well past due for reauthorization. Some of the research I'm conducting right now, not very optimistic that something's going to get done anytime in the near future. As you might know, Senator Lamar Alexander, who is the current chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, is retiring at the end of this term. So as of January 3rd, when the new Congress gets sworn in, he won't be chairing that committee anymore. So it remains to be seen who's going to be chairing that committee. And a lot of that will depend on, do the Democrats win control of the Senate? And then it will probably be Senator Patty Murray. But if Republicans retain control of the Senate, I think the second most senior Republican, if I'm not mistaken, on that committee is also retiring. And the third most senior is in a tough reelection battle right now. So we don't really know who the chair will be. Some people who I've interviewed in my research have said that if it can't get done with Lamar Alexander, who actually has a good working relationship with Senator Patty Murray, then it's unlikely that the Senate will reach a consensus on a bill to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. The other thing you should know is that the Higher Education Act reauthorization is massive. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. It entails a lot of higher education programs and federal policy, and it's really unlikely that you'll get the parties to agree to every single component of a reauthorization. And one of the components proving to be a real sticking point right now is Title IX policy. The parties are just very far apart on Title IX, and it's unlikely that the Democrats will agree to a reauthorization that doesn't include a comprehensive bill. The Democrats had already said no to sort of a mini HEA bill in 2019. They want a comprehensive reauthorization. So to answer your question, I don't think we are going to see an HEA reauthorization anytime soon.
Being 12 years away from the last reauthorization, is it detrimental for institutions and the students that are served to not have an updated HEA?
That's a good question. I think that it is detrimental because I think that the institutions want to have some sort of clarity on what the future holds for these programs. There hasn't been, the fact that we haven't had a reauthorization has not resulted in huge disruptions. But once there is a reauthorization, then at least there's a little bit more certainty about what the programs will entail and how long they'll be around, at least for, in the near future, for planning for that purpose. But the other thing is, because Congress has not been able to pass a reauthorization, we actually do see a lot more executive action happening with regard to higher education policy. And so that's why you see the tremendous differences from one presidential administration to the next, because Congress isn't doing a whole lot of legislating in the higher education sector. You see the Department of Education sort of stepping in and doing that policymaking through the rulemaking process. So it's a little bit removed again from that democratic process, because Congress, again, they're elected by the voters, and the Department of Education is a couple of steps removed from that. But also you see the big changes from one presidential administration to the next every 4 years, every 4 to 8 years.
And so, speaking of the Department of Education, I've just been so interested in really the unmaking of higher education policy, more so the rollback of Obama era regulations and rules. And as you see all the headlines, rollback, repeal, the way that the current administration has put more students at risk. Is this part of the ebb and flow of policymaking every 4 to 8 years, or is what we're seeing these last 4 years something different?
You know what, I think this is exactly what I was just talking about a few moments ago, where we see the policy being made through the Department of Education. You see on this slide reference to the Dear Colleague letters. That's guidance. That's not a regulation that goes through the Administrative Procedure Act's rulemaking process, but it's treated as binding by the institution. So when the first Title IX guidance came out in the Obama administration, institutions took steps to comply with that guidance, and they put processes in place, and they spent their resources on it. Then that guidance got revoked, and it sent the institutions again into questioning, what do we do now? How do we update our processes? Are we still in compliance? And then, of course, the Department of Education did go through the Administrative Procedure Act's rulemaking process to create a binding regulation more recently. So now it's binding, unlike the guidance, which wasn't, even though it was treated like it was binding. Same thing with gainful employment. The regulations went through. The very first gainful employment rule came out in 2010. That rule faced a legal challenge from the for-profit higher education sector, and that sector was successful in getting a key component of the original gainful employment rule struck down, and that component was sort of central to the entire rule. So the Obama administration went through the whole rulemaking process again, issued another regulation in 2014, and then that regulation was in place until 2019, when the Trump administration came in and Betsy DeVos, and they went through the rulemaking process once again and repealed the gainful employment rule. So you do see the sort of back and forth. And I don't want to say that it's just a function of the last 4 years, because when I was doing my dissertation research, which is about the rulemaking process, I was conducting my interviews and people were telling me about how the Obama administration was doing something very different in the rulemaking process than the Bush administration had done before that, which had issued some regulations that were more favorable to the for-profit sector.
Is there a way to briefly summarize what the rulemaking process looks like?
Yeah. So the rulemaking process takes place in the United States Department of Education. I mentioned a few moments ago the Administrative Procedure Act, and so that's one of the federal laws that sort of governs what happens in the rulemaking process. Another law that governs it is the Higher Education Act itself, which states that for regulations of Title IV federal student financial aid programs, the Department of Education has to conduct a negotiated rulemaking process. And what that is, it's a process of bringing stakeholders in the proposed rule into conversation with Department of Education officials to negotiate the language of the proposed rule. They issue a call for nominations. People will nominate potential negotiators, and then the Department of Education selects the negotiators. They bring them down to Washington for a few days at a time across a period of several months, and they try to work out that language. If they reach consensus, if every single negotiator on that panel agrees with the language of the proposed rule, then that becomes the language that's put into the notice of proposed rulemaking that goes in the Federal Register. If even one party to the negotiated rulemaking dissents, and that could be the department's own negotiator, then the department gets to write the proposed rule on its own. So we don't see consensus too much nowadays, but we do see it on occasion. There was consensus in the early 2019 rulemaking. There was consensus in 2015 on the repay rulemaking for an income-based loan repayment program. But more often than not, you don't see consensus on that language. Once the proposed rule goes into the Federal Register, then it goes out for notice and comment. So there's a set period of time, usually between 30 and 60 days, where people can submit comments on the proposed rule to the Department of Education. It's done typically nowadays through regulations.gov, so it's right on the internet. And then the department is required to review all of those comments that come in and respond to them. They don't have to respond to every single one. Sometimes they get tens of thousands of comments, but they do have to group them together into categories and make sure they respond to all of them, just not individually. And the department doesn't have to listen to the comments either. You know, they could get 90% of their comments could be saying, don't do this, this is terrible, please don't do this. And they don't have to change it. Although my research found that sometimes the department does pay attention to what's said in the comments, and they do change their positions a little bit along the margins usually in response to them. No major changes typically at that point. And then the final regulation comes out, and that is a binding law.
I think one of the purposes for these critical policy conversations is to bring awareness to community members and to move them towards being advocates, whether it's faculty, whether it's researchers, whether it's graduate students. Do you find that there's an opportunity for us to be more engaged in the public comment process, or even sponsored to be one of the negotiators?
I actually do. I think that it would be beneficial for the rules, the regulations, to have a researcher on the negotiated rulemaking team. You don't typically see that. It does happen on occasion, but usually the people that represent higher education institutions are their administrative staff. Sometimes it could be a financial aid administrator. Sometimes it could be a college president. It's very rarely a researcher. But the reason I think that having a researcher on the panel would be useful is because the Department of Education is required to base their regulations on reason. It's a standard that under the Administrative Procedure Act, that if a court finds a regulation to be arbitrary and capricious, then they're going to say to the agency, you can't do this. You don't have a solid basis for issuing this regulation. I think that it would benefit the Department of Education to actually have a researcher on the negotiating team. So that's one thing. And sending in research during the notice and comment period, absolutely. Anybody can send in a comment, and you can send in an entire report. You can send in multiple reports. And again, it sort of behooves the department to pay attention to that, because they want to make sure that their regulations are based on evidence of some kind and they're not arbitrary and capricious. Now, having said that, my research has also found that research is not really relied upon that much in this process. And when it is, you typically have a situation where policymakers know what they want to do, and then they go out and find the research that justifies it. It's called the political use of research, and Carol Weiss, who was the pioneer of the research utilization literature that I relied upon in my studies, recognized it many years ago. And then I, of course, recognized it in this process. But that doesn't mean that the research is not going to have an impact at all. In fact, I think it was useful in creating the more controversial regulations so that the Department of Education officials could point to research and say, this isn't arbitrary and capricious. We are basing this on something, and here's the report that says it.
Your work speaks to me to consider how, my scholarship and the evidence that I produce is first like known, understood, right? And then used by policymakers, whether that's as insight, as discussion points, or as you've mentioned, as sources for newer revised rules and regulations. In reading your work, you find that at times our research might be ineffective for a variety of reasons to influence individuals with the power to shape federal policy. So, I mean, what insight do you have to help us overcome that divide and to truly translate our research into information that is leveraged by policymakers?
I think it can be done. And I think that researchers should try to write for audiences that are more policy audiences. So this is difficult sometimes, because if you're on a tenure track, for example, and you need to publish in peer-reviewed scholarly journals, you're going to want to do that. At the same time, those journals aren't always accessible to people who work in policy advocacy and to policymakers. And they're often finding reports and white papers on research center websites and think tank websites and things like that. So I think what researchers can do to get the word out about their research is to make policy briefs, just short, bullet pointed, in plain language, explaining what their study was about and what it found and why it could be useful for policymakers in policymaking. Blog about your research on your own personal website, get it out into social media, make connections with people who work in the think tanks and in the policy community, so make sure they're aware of your research. It's also useful to write op-eds and other short opinion pieces and have them published in outlets that policymakers read. And so in the higher education policy community, they read Inside Higher Education, the Chronicle of Higher Education, some of the newer publications as well that focus on education policy, and of course the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. But if you can get an op-ed or some sort of reporting on your research in those outlets, that would be really useful as well. One of the best things you can do is just learn about the process itself, learn about how does policy get made, what's motivating the policymakers, and figure out how you can have an impact. Some of the people who I've spoken to in my research have said that it's really important for people in the higher education community to sort of come together collectively and advocate. I mean, higher education at this point, it's a very difficult time for higher education right now. And so if the higher education community can come together and advocate collectively, there's strength in numbers. And so we might be able to have more of a voice and advocate for more funding, for better policies that help higher education. It's difficult, I think, in the current climate. Higher education is so looking at each other as competition right now, instead of collaborators. But from the people I speak to in the policy community, that collaboration is important, coming together and advocating as a community for what higher education needs. So I would like to see more of that sort of collective action.
Thank you so much for your time, for your insight, and for your continued advocacy for us to become more aware about the rulemaking process. I really appreciate it, as well as making time to have this conversation on a Friday evening.
And thank you so much for having me on and asking such great questions. I enjoyed it.
Thank you all so much. I truly appreciate y'all tuning into our 5th episode of Critical Policy Conversations.